The Attorney General making his remarks as large and peaceful protests are underway. We have one on the screen now in Minneapolis at the site where George Floyd was killed, but also underway on the streets of Boston, West Hollywood, and New York City. We are joined for our coverage by MSNBC legal analyst Maya Wiley, by the director of the Black Law Enforcement Alliance and retired NYPD detective Mark Claxton, and by former acting Solicitor General Neal Katyal. Neal Katyal, first on the law. I thought some of the most interesting things he said there were at the end, and that's always the benefit. I've learned this from my colleagues of getting that one last question. And he leaned in and said these cases have been under prosecuted. Your thoughts on that comment, and what does that mean for these 4 cases?
These cases have, in general, been under prosecuted. I think he's exactly right. And at a sad moment in time, this is news today, is a welcome development. The under prosecution was actually even in this very case, Nicole, because last week, you might recall, they charged Officer Chauvin only with 3rd-degree murder. And today, those charges were upgraded to 2nd degree. Why does that matter? The 2nd degree is a much more serious offense under Minnesota law. The statute 609 says you can have up to 40 years in prison for it. And 3rd-degree murder, actually, those charges were very vulnerable and likely to be tossed out because they require, if the one defense in Minnesota to 3rd-degree murder is bizarrely, I actually intended to harm this specific victim, not just randomly intended harm in general. And that's a defense to 3rd-degree murder. So it's really 2nd-degree murder that captures it. And I think the more important point, Nicole, is the charging of the other 3, the bystander officers. They just stood by and did nothing. And it's a bit of a shame that it took so long for these charges to develop. But kind of like Jodie Foster's movie, The Accused, when you have people standing by and doing nothing, and what made it worse was that these were officers who were sworn to protect us, sworn to protect Floyd, and they did nothing. And these charges today go after those 3, and I think that's huge.
Neal Katyal, it is something that I keep asking, and no one has been able to answer it yet. The world is watching. There are protests on the streets of Paris. There are protests on, I think they've broken out in more than 100 American cities since George Floyd's death just over a week ago. The world is watching. I mean, how do we know that the right charges are brought in a timely manner when no one's watching?
Yeah, no, the charges, I think, are a good first step. But I thought what Attorney General Olson said at the end was really important. He said, look, charges are one thing, but we have to have the slow process of rebuilding our institutions and demonstrating trust and faith. And certainly, you know, this all didn't start with Donald Trump. You know, police brutality against African Americans goes back to the antebellum era, and today it's manifest in what counties do, what mayors do, what police departments do. But this president, of course, poured kerosene on it, and aided by a bunch of local officials. And I think, to answer your question, Nicole, when we ask, what can we do? The most important thing we can do is vote and demand reform and accountability. There's a reason why last night Stephen King was crying in his white sheets, and it has to do with the fact that people voted.
Mark Claxton, this is your work, this is your expertise, your thoughts on the cases and on the conversation Neal and I just started.
Well, it's clearly this announcement by Attorney General Ellison is a major and consequential announcement. It is undoubtedly moving forward. I'm sure at some point we'll probably find out that there was some additional either witness statements, witness video, witness audio that perhaps we haven't seen yet, and quite possibly even some additional information that came as a result of the body-worn cameras that one of the journalists asked about. So I think that's one component. I think it was a very sobering announcement because he was careful to indicate that we have to be realistic in our expectations, and he wanted to temper down some of the expectations because history is clear about the difficulties and the challenges you have when you're trying to prosecute police officers in the course of their duties. And thirdly, he did something that's perhaps most significant, and Neal Katyal referenced this. He charged interested parties to come up and be part of the solutions moving forward. Don't rely on these singular incidents or singular episodes or singular prosecutions. He recognized there's a need for a holistic improvement, that there's a need for reform, and he's charged the interested parties along with government officials to work towards that goal.
And Mark, I imagine that it's not just the folks out demonstrating, it's not just the people covering this that are watching Attorney General Ellison's charges and his decisions there closely. I imagine most police officers and police departments are watching closely. What would have been, would the same things have stood out for people running police departments and trying to do right by their officers and by the communities they serve?
If Attorney General Ellison's movements thus far are any indication of a larger movement, then police departments across the nation should be preparing for some modification to the way that they conducted themselves as it relates to communities of color. Listen, reform is in the air, and I think it'd be wise, in spite of the fact that instead of us having a commander-in-chief, we have a provocateur-in-chief. There is quite clearly a reform feeling and sentiment in the air. In spite of a national security advisor who denies the very existence of racial issues as it relates to law enforcement, reform is clearly present and in the air. And I think it's undeniable that departments across the nation are paying special attention and preparing for some level of reform. The question is how wide, how extensive that reform will be.
Maya Wiley, Mark calls him the provocateur. Neil talked about Donald Trump pouring gasoline on the fire. The reality is Donald Trump at this hour has militarized and federalized the police force that is charged with what have been largely peaceful protests in Washington, D.C. These seem like, I'm a California girl, so I always use an earthquake reference here, but these seem like the tectonic plates along the San Andreas Fault pressing so hard in the opposite direction that a rupture could be imminent. What do you make of these two very different forces colliding today with Attorney General Ellison's announcement?
Well, I think what's so important about Attorney General Ellison's announcement is, one, he made a very clear, concise attempt to say, on law enforcement, we all have to be on the same side. While he has essentially leveled a critique against the district attorneys of his own state by saying these are under prosecuted, at the same time he's saying we're working together, and he called in his partnership with the federal government as well, with the Department of Justice. We were watching leadership that said we must work together in a fair, neutral way, but that carries the weight of justice with it. And the thing we've heard from Donald Trump, exactly the opposite. I mean, I would actually use stronger language and call him the tyrant in chief, because his attempts to actually draw a false equivalency and suggest that the problem we were facing in this country was that a quote unquote far left extremists were somehow, kind of blowing up our democracy, when the reality was, one, the FBI has just said we haven't found the evidence that there's some far left extremist elements. What we have is angry citizens, and we certainly have some who go too far. But his suggestion that his need to be seen as strong and powerful is more important than the Constitution of the United States, is more important than allowing local law enforcement to be local law enforcement. What we were seeing in Keith Ellison is this is how it works at state and local level, and we will work in partnership with federal government when you allow it. But as a country, as residents, it's our job to say, yeah, and you're not allowed to treat us the way we saw demonstrators being treated in Washington, because he needed a press conference and some photo opportunity. Our democracy is not a photo opportunity, and Donald Trump must not be unchecked in his attempts to essentially break down this critically important wall we have between our military and domestic law enforcement, because that is tyrannical.
Maya, you have brought us to all the other headlines of the day, the real rupture between Donald Trump and the head of the Pentagon, Secretary Esper, and I want to get to it. But before I make that turn, I want to ask you about the man and the grieving family at the center of all of this. Attorney General Ellison said that George Floyd is basically the heart of all this, and now this work will go on. In the last 12 hours, we've seen his daughter, we've heard from his son. Nothing. Not a good legal turn, not charges that are justified. Nothing brings back a loved one. But where do you think that the strength and the grace and Terrence Floyd, George Floyd's brother, I think a couple days ago was at the site where his brother lost his life underneath police officer Derek Chauvin. And where do you think the strength comes from to, in some ways, be more of a leader than our current president?
You know, this is something we see day in, day out, year in, year out, generation in, generation out. In the Black community, this is a common occurrence, and we are constantly calling upon the nation to see and recognize the pain of injustice. And unfortunately, the very thing that happened to George Floyd are the things that we and our families are talking to our children about every single day. My daughter goes out to protest. I'm telling her how to care for herself. I'm telling her how to be careful for herself. I'm having her have her friends write my cell number on their arms. This is a grace that we have carried for generations, and we will keep carrying it because our hope is in the aspiration of a country that lives up to its desire for democracy.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.